we do, roll call, please.
First up, we have you, Chair Brassfield,
Present.
Vice Chair Freeman,
Present.
Commissioner Dawson,
Here.
Commissioner Fletcher, absent, Commissioner
While
Latassa.
brushing your
He's right there.
Commissioner
he is.
Fletcher's here.
He snuck in. I didn't see him on the list. Can we just get a verbal confirmation from Commissioner Fletcher that he's here?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you so much. And Commissioner Milich.
Here.
I'm sorry, I don't know if I already called Commissioner Latassa.
You sort of skipped me, but I'm present.
Sorry about that.
No
it's
problem.
part of the mix-up. And then finally, we have Commissioner Reed, who we've confirmed is already absent.
So we have one absence. I believe we're going to have a presentation, but let's open the consent agenda. I think that we have some minutes. Anybody have any comments on the minutes of the previous meeting? I
No.
believe that was the 12th.
No.
I move to accept the minutes as presented.
Thank you.
Second.
And we have a first and a second. All in favor, let's do a roll call.
Chair Brassfield,
Yes.
Vice Chair Freeman,
Yes.
Commissioner Dawson,
Yes.
Commissioner Fletcher,
Yes.
Commissioner Latassa,
Yes.
Commissioner Milich,
Save the best for last. Yes.
Ah,
and then
the motion
Commissioner
passed.
Reed is absent.
And the motion passes. Thank you. Going to open up public comment, but please, if you would, state your name for the record, and we will not be making comments on a non-agenda item. So let's hear from the public.
Sure thing, Chair. So I just wanted to take a minute to go over all of the information in regards to making a public comment at this meeting. We do encourage members of the public to join our meeting via Zoom Gov because you're connected live to a secure government meeting. This meeting is also streamed live on youtube.com/City of Monterey, where there's an approximate 10-second delay, and on Comcast channel 25, where there's up to a 90-second delay. If you'd like to provide a public comment, please join the meeting using Zoom or by telephone, making sure you join in time to accommodate these delays. To join the Zoom meeting from a computer or phone, you can use the link or phone number on the agenda posted at isearchmonterey.org. And since the meeting has already begun, you'll find the agenda under the recent tab. To join by telephone, you can dial 833-568-8864, which is toll free, or 669-254-5252. And you can enter the webinar ID, which is 161-990-8039. And if you're prompted to enter a participant ID, simply press pound. Detailed instructions on how to use Zoom are available at monterey.org/public meetings. And if you'd like to make a public comment, simply raise your hand in Zoom, or if you're connected by phone, dial *9 to raise your hand, then *6 to unmute yourself when called upon. Public commenters will be muted until it's their turn to speak. And we ask that if you're making a public comment, please turn off TV or computer speakers or simply go into another room while connected by phone, as background noise will interfere with the broadcast. And I will call on each speaker in order of hands raised, and the chair has designated a 3-minute time limit for today's meeting where a countdown will appear on the screen. So we ask that you stay within your time limit. Again, this is a public comment for items not on the agenda. And it looks like we do not have any public comments at this time.
Thank you. Since we don't have anybody, let me know if we get one and sliding in. And let's open up the first public appearance item. I think we have a staff presentation.
Yes, thank you, Chair Brassfield. In a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Fernanda Riveri, Andrea Rennie, and Marissa Garcia, our internal team that's been working on this issue for several months now. Basically, what's in front of you is a relatively new concept. It's called vehicle miles traveled. It's been adopted by the state of California as a new metric to evaluate transportation impacts. And our in-house team has been working with a very talented group of traffic engineers, both Michael Schmidt and Frederick Venter, who have helped us navigate through this new legislation and to propose to you this afternoon a new policy that's required by law to be adopted. So with that, I'll turn it over to Fernanda Riveri. She's our interim principal planner that has been working on this project with the consultant team.
Thank you, Kim. Kim, that was a great introduction. I would just like to add that, like Kim said, this is new legislation. This changes the way that we have to evaluate transportation impacts under CEQA. We used to evaluate impacts under what was called the level of service metric. And basically what that means is transportation impacts from a project were measured by the traffic congestion that the project caused. So a delay at a traffic intersection, how long you would need to stop and keep basically be stuck in traffic. But the new metric, which is vehicle miles traveled, it basically focuses on how many miles are people traveling. And that's now the level of the threshold for transportation impacts. If you're driving too many miles, that could be a significant impact because it would increase our greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a big change from traffic congestion to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and car travel in general. But I will let our consultants explain that a little further. So I'd like to introduce Michael Schmidt and Frederick Venter from Kimley Horn and Associates. They have prepared a presentation for you about our proposed vehicle miles traveled policy and thresholds of significance.
Fernanda, can I just say one quick thing, please?
Sure.
I'm Monterey Rennie, City Traffic Engineer, and I just want to say that these efforts were funded through a Caltrans grant and also Measure X, our county transportation measure. Thank you.
I will show a presentation, and Michael will present.
Great, thank you, Fernanda. Good afternoon, Chairman Brassfield and Commissioners. I'm going to be talking, as Fernanda said, about SB 743 and traffic analysis. So if you want to look to the next slide. So this is the agenda we set up to kind of go through today. And I'll kind of warn you in advance, it's a little bit longer than maybe a typical presentation would be, but that's a little bit because this is a big change. It's kind of a paradigm shift in how the state approaches significant impacts. So what I wanted to kind of do first is kind of reflect back of where we've been. So talk a little bit about level of service, and then we'll dive into talking about SB 743, which the principal metric or performance metric is vehicle miles traveled, like we talked about, but we'll get into a little more detail what that means. And then we'll move on to talking about the proposed city's policy. And then we'll kind of close out with talking about what future meetings we'll cover during those and give you the opportunity to ask questions. So the level of service has been around since the 1950s, and actually the way we measure it is captured in a document called the Highway Capacity Manual, and that's been put out through cooperation through several federal agencies for more than 60 years, in fact. But as time has gone on, we've kind of learned that it's not quite everything we'd hoped it to be. In fact, there's level of service has led to some less than desirable transportation outcomes under some instances, including urban sprawl. Sometimes it's led to impacts to active transportation. If you think about an intersection that's perhaps gotten larger and larger to accommodate traffic, well, that's has negatively impacted pedestrians and bicyclists potentially. And then recently, we've also learned about something called induced demand. And what induced demand basically is that we've kind of learned when you build a freeway and you widen the freeway, suddenly it starts to backfill. We start seeing more traffic come. And what that is the result of is that congestion kind of has this effect of suppressing trips. But as we reduce the congestion levels, more trips come to pass, and that's called induced demand. The great thing about level of service is we have so much experience about it, we really understand the outcome. So as we move into this SB 743 thing, it's kind of worth pointing out that we're still learning as we go. Kind of, it's only been around as a principal measure of effectiveness since the last year or so, really, in California. And it's worth pointing out that one of the big changes of this legislation is that level of service is not a CEQA consideration any longer. It doesn't mean you can't use level of service, but you can't use level of service in the context of CEQA any longer. Next slide. So just as a reminder, what level of service really talks about is it's really about the driver's experience. And we measure that through a series of grades, level of service A through F. So it's kind of similar to what your school report card might look like. But it really gets at the intensity of congestion or delay. So you can see with A, very low congestion, level of service F, very severe congestion. And like I said, once again, the change in law doesn't preclude us from using this, but no longer can we use this as the basis for finding a significant transportation impact. So let's start talking about SB 743 and VMT. I'd like to always start off with this graphic when I talk about it, because this kind of makes the point about why there's becoming an increasing emphasis on VMT, because there's a strong correlation between VMT and greenhouse gas emissions. And what this is the state passed a requirement called SB 150, which was basically, they said, we want to do a report card on how we're doing against our greenhouse gas goals. So they basically evaluated all the MPOs throughout the state. And this is a graphic from the executive summary. And what you can see is the executive summary shows us is that while we had a downturn in VMT and greenhouse gases, it's actually started to twist back up. And that isn't completely surprising, because we can all kind of look at this graphic and say, okay, well, I see what's going on. The economy started to take a dive in 2005, 6, 7, 8, and we had the recession. And then as the economy got better, it started to increase back up. And then obviously what's happened over the last year has actually led to a reduction in VMT. Interestingly enough, even though this graphic doesn't show that. But the two green dots out there you see, those are the goals the state has, really. So the state is seeking to reduce greenhouse gases in both 2020 and 2035, and there's measurable amounts we're trying to do. So you can see as we enter into this SB 743 effort, things are headed in the wrong direction right now. Next slide. So just to give an overview of SB 743, once again, it's CEQA specific. So what we're talking about only relates to the CEQA evaluation of a transportation significant impact. SB 743 is a little bit broader than just greenhouse gases, although that's a principal interest of SB 743, but it does seek to promote sustainability and reduce greenhouse gases through denser infill development, reducing single occupancy vehicles, and improving transit. SB 743 became a requirement for all CEQA documentation as of July 1st, 2020. So any documents you see from that date forward, you should expect to see this as the basis for that determination. And the Office of Planning and Research, which is under the governor's purview, is responsible for having put in the guidance together that many of us, including the policy that we've recommended to you, have used as a basis for developing throughout the state. One of the key elements of this, and we'll talk about this a little more in a few minutes, is that as a new development comes in, it really has an expectation that we're going to look at the different unique land uses in that development separately. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a few minutes. But then again, once again, VMT is the principal metric. And again, SB 743 does not preclude level of service. Next slide. So here's just a simple kind of illustration. So what is vehicle miles traveled? Well, really, in a very simple sense, it's just the number of vehicles traveling over some distance. So if you kind of look at this illustration, you'll see, we have 4 vehicles. They're traveling 3 miles. So 4 times 3 is 12 VMT. So pretty simple, but that's basically the performance metric we're now using. Next slide. So I'm going to get into a little bit of technical detail here, but it's kind of important to perhaps understanding how we create these thresholds, because now we've got new thresholds of significance where we had level of service before. Now different land uses have different thresholds. So we don't have one universal metric that applies to all land uses. So and I'm going to talk about 3 specific examples, actually 4. I'm going to talk about residential, I'm going to talk about office, retail, and I'm going to give an example of how a hotel might function on this. So how we calculate VMT for a residence. So let's imagine this we're going to take a single residence as the example here, but you got to kind of imagine this would be, 200 homes or 50 homes or 10 homes, but it would be an aggregation. What we basically do is we estimate the number of miles you make trips over the course of the day. So you imagine a family would make a trip to school, to shopping, to work, and the return trip back. And then we divide through by those numbers to come up with a per capita or per person BMT, and that's the threshold. So we set a threshold based on that. So for example, we'll get to it in a few minutes, but I think it's around 10 vehicle miles per person is what the threshold is in the city. Next slide. Similarly, we do the same idea with an office. So if you think about an office as being a new land use and we're evaluating it from a CEQA standpoint, we once again look at all the trips that those employees would make over the course of the day. So there's the trip to work, there's a supplier trip perhaps, a customer trip to visit at the office, and we calculate those various trips up, the BMT, divide through by the employee, and we come out with a per employee BMT. And we'll talk about what the threshold is, but I think it's close to 7 if I remember correctly without looking at the slide. Now that's two of the easier ones. It's kind of this per person, per employee one. Well, we've got some other unique land uses that we often have to deal with. And one of them I'm going to talk about is retail. And one of the takeaways from today, perhaps, is that retail is a real beneficiary from SB 743 because the way we look at BMT from the lens of retail is very good for a typical retail store. So if you think about what's kind of happens, and if you look on the left, you can kind of see, imagine, there's 2 grocery stores or two CVS's or Walgreens or whatever they might be. And right now, we all make visits to those stores because of the necessities. We need food, we need medications, we need whatever, so we have to make those trips. Well, if a new store gets added, as you can see on the right, what happens is some folks gravitate to that closer store because often we make those choices based on proximity. We won't drive. Most of us don't have such a strong preference for a particular store that we may drive a very, very far distance to go to that store. We'll probably go to the one that's closest that has the things that we want to buy. So you can see that has the net effect of reducing VMT actually by building that new store kind of thing. So what we do is we measure the VMT for a whole area, and you can kind of see at the bottom, we're kind of just, as an example, we said there's 5 million. And once we add this little new store, well, the VMT overall goes down just a little bit, and that's enough to say the threshold being a net reduction, that there would not be a significant impact. So like I said, retail is one of the big beneficiaries of this. Next slide. Similarly, I kind of put this slide together, and this kind of is just to give you an idea how a hotel situation might work. So if you look on the left, you just kind of imagine, everybody, let's imagine the primary reason folks are coming to these hotels is they're going to the beach or the convention center, and so they want to be in close proximity to it. So if you kind of imagine all these hotels are very busy and bustling and everything else, if we add a new one and we add it very much closer to the destination where people want to be, well, it has the net effect of shortening trips overall kind of thing. Because if I weren't able to stay at that hotel, you can see the new hotel on the right, well, I'd have to stay much further away. So my trips out to the beach and the other trips that I make over the course of the day would be much longer than if I had that opportunity. So similarly, other uses kind of like retail, if they're placed close to where activities are, can have a VMT reduction and end up in not having a significant impact. Next slide, please. So I made the point early on that we have to look at when we look at a development, we have to look at each land use on it separately. And this is a change from level of service, because typically when we talked about level of service, if we had a development project, we just looked at the project in its entirety. We didn't really get too fixated on what were the different land uses on the site. Well, in this example, let's just imagine we had a site with a residential project, some homes, and an office on it, and retail. So it's a nice mixed use project. Well, with SB 743, we actually have to consider each one of those individual land uses that are part of that project on its own. So in this example, you can see I've got thresholds and analysis for each one of them and an impact, so that if we look at the residential, it's under, and we look at the retail, well, it's under, so that's good. Office is high. So this would be a finding of significance for office. So in this scenario, if we had a development like this, it would be a significant impact because of the office. Next slide. So one of the things that OPR gave recommendations for was setting the thresholds. And it's worth pointing out that the thresholds are pretty aggressive really when you kind of look at them, because basically for residential and office, We look at the average. So for residential, we're looking at the average of the city for VMT travel per person. And then we're going 15% below that. And similarly, we're doing the same thing with office, except office, we look at a larger area for work trips, so that covers the whole county. But we also look at 15% below the average. So I just want to make the point that these are pretty aggressive goals the state has set. And the basis for them setting that is, CARB and others have looked at this and said, okay, these are the reductions we need over time to meet those graphs that I showed you at the beginning, to bend our curves down for our greenhouse gases and our VMT to come down to where we want them to be. It's worth pointing out too, just a couple other items quickly, is that CEQA doesn't actually doesn't prescribe thresholds, and OPR is in fact guidance. Most jurisdictions throughout the state are probably bending towards following that guidance, but technically you're not required to follow OPR, but we've designed yours to substantially follow that. And if you decide not to follow the requirements or the suggestions of OPR, what's really required is called substantial evidence, which basically means you have to have a pretty strong case for a different approach to evaluating VMT. Next slide. So I won't, this is probably an overwhelming amount of information, but there's a document that's been prepared that covers, what's the process. So a new developer comes in with a project and says, hey, I've got this project and I need to do environmental clearance and I need to take a look at transportation. Well, how do I do it? So there's the document that's been prepared is very geared towards the practitioner. And it's developed into 6 basic steps. And there's, the long flow chart if you really want to get into the detail that's in there too, but really kind of steps you through exactly what is required by the city so that I can, get my project evaluated and work through the needs of my project. So I'll cover each one of these 6 steps in the next few slides. So the first one is really evaluating the land use type. So the first thing we do is we define the project land use in terms of ITE. And the only reason that matters is that ITE is kind of a universal language for transportation engineers. So we first start off by putting it in terms that other transportation professionals and the city's accustomed to, and there's documentation. So we first define it in that. Then we also kind of flag any project that's mixed use. So like I said, if you have a project that has multiple different types of things going on, residential and retail and office, well, we flag that because we want to give the special credit to, if we have a neat project that has great interaction on site, well, we want to take credit for that BMT, those trips that don't leave the site. And then we also want to flag any projects that are redevelopment. And I'll talk about why redevelopment is special in a few minutes. Next slide. So there are some ways that as you enter into your analysis, you bring a project forward that you can avoid having to do a super detailed analysis. There are some opportunities to make a presumption of non-significance. And what that basically means is these are kind of like, if you meet any one of these criteria, we can basically just assume that you're not going to have a significant impact. And so these are detailed exactly what the requirements are, but this graphic kind of just touches on them. But it covers everything from small projects to transit to local serving retail, like I said, affordable housing, local essential services, which is more of this kind of retail type environment, map-based screening and redevelopment projects. But there's more detail provided in the document. And if you have any questions, we can talk about any one of these but there is a good list of opportunities to make those changes. All right, next up, Tim. So this example is for the purposes of explaining a redevelopment project. So on the left, just imagine for a moment that we've got an existing location that has 10,000 vehicle miles traveled per day, and it's a retail and office development. But somebody then comes in and says, hey, well, I'm going to remove these uses. I'm going to tear these uses down, and I'm going to build a new project. And the new project has only 7,500 VMT. Well, you're allowed to, under those circumstances, make a presumption of non-significance just based on the fact that what you're replacing it with is less intense than what's already on site. Next slide. These are the exact thresholds that have been calculated for the city. That covers residential, office, and basically every other use is in some way covered by the other ones, kind of thing. And these measurements have come out of with the travel demand models. So the AMBAG models, the opportune tool that we've used to develop these, and so they've been calculated, with pretty high level of precision, and they're spatially oriented. So it's representative of the city and the county, and we've got detailed information that's been prepared for several different areas within the city as well. The next task that will be to developers to prepare the scope of analysis. So they will prepare a document that says, hey, here's our project. We've gone through the first few steps of planning it, and here's the types of analysis we're going to do. And they can provide that to the city, and then the city staff can take a look at it and make sure that there's agreement on the scope of the effort that they're going to undertake to avoid having to redo it, and make sure that we have agreement about the analysis techniques that are going to be completed. Next slide. Step 5 is pretty easy. This is when you do the analysis. And during this step, we're going to identify any needs for mitigation. So if you do your analysis and it comes back and you find out you have a significant impact, well, this is the point where we start talking about mitigation. So CEQA requires that if you have a significant impact, that you consider feasible mitigation. And so the two primary sources the primary source of mitigation to date has really been what we call transportation demand measures. And those kind of fall into two buckets I'll talk about on the next slide for a second. But basically, it's infrastructure or incentive ideas, and we'll talk about what that means in a second. But one of the other key things about mitigation is that CEQA requires that it be monitored. It's not a trustless system. You have to make sure that whatever mitigation folks put forward for a development or a project is monitored to make sure that it's actually carried out. Next slide. And this is just to talk quickly about how do we mitigate VMT, because mitigating VMT is very different than level of service. With level of service, it was a little clearer to everyone because we knew exactly what to do. If we had an intersection that had an impact, well, we could do it things like improve the signal time. We could put a left turn in. We could put a right turn in. Widen the intersection. And there's a couple different ways we could approach it. It's a little more complicated with VMT, and these are just some of the different examples that folks can implement to reduce VMT. And you can see there's a lot of different ways to do it, but that's basically the idea is it's either shortening your trip somehow or eliminating a trip. So, things like if we gave you a free transit ticket, well, and you took a bus, well, that would reduce one trip from a vehicle. So one VMT would go away. Things like showers, bike racks, all that kind of stuff promotes the idea of people moving to alternate modes, which also reduces VMT. And there's a whole host of different programs or approaches. And the city has in the appendice of the guidelines, there's a long list of different approaches that folks can take with a recommended reduction you can potentially take for that too. So that's covered in detail in the city's guidelines as well. Next slide. And then the final one is if this is required, like I said, if you have a significant impact, well, mitigation monitoring is required too. Won't dive into too much of the detail, but this is typically one of the more challenging parts of VMT we're all learning, just because it's not quite as easy, like I said, to say, well, go build that intersection or go do that improvement. It's a little harder to monitor whether or not somebody has put a policy in place. Like every year they're buying bus tickets for their employees if they said that's what they're going to do. So we're all kind of learning through this process, but most of what's happening typically throughout the state is folks are putting these into conditions of approval for their project and saying you're agreeing to do these items as part of the conditions. Next slide. So one of the things we completed, for the city was we prepared a VMT calculator. So it's basically a very kind of a spreadsheet very complex spreadsheet that actually is intended to simplify the analysis process. So the city staff has this and they're familiarizing themselves with it now. But it basically gives you the opportunity that you can type an address in or a location. You can use the description of the project. So if you have residential or an office or whatever, you can put the information in about that and put the number of units in, and you start getting output. And you can see that this tool, you can see there's in the middle, it gives you the VMT output. It tells you how much your mitigation is going to offset it. So there's kind of an easy sketch planning tool that's been developed for the city that this kind of can be used in several different ways. It can be used for analysis, but it can also just be used to kind of help screen and help plan projects. So folks can get a sense of, as they're thinking through what they might want to do, what the impact or implications might be of that. So that's available as well. Next slide. So just as we close out, just want to make the point that there's several mobility considerations that aren't covered by VMT. VMT doesn't address everything. Obviously, there are concerns about safety, access, congestion, multimodal. Those are all things we're still concerned about, and VMT doesn't necessarily address all of those. So as you work through the implementation of VMT, we still have to have conversations about how we make sure that these things are all being taken care of. And so there'll still be a future conversation to have about, how level of service is continued to be used in the city, or if it's continued to be used outside of CEQA. Great, and I think that's the last slide. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you for your time.
Mr. Chair, I have a question.
Mike,
Well, I'll just ask it then.
yes, I think you're muted.
Go ahead, Terry.
Okay. Thanks for your presentation, Michael. So were you involved in the waterfront traffic study that was done 2 months ago, or that was presented to us 2 months ago?
I don't believe so.
Oh, wait, Frederick, he's talking about the transportation adaptation plan. And Frederick was the traffic engineer involved with the adaptation plan.
Right. So, I mean, that's the most recent one that I'm familiar with. So just as an illustrative kind of a question, how would this change of, to this, this trip, a metric, how would that have changed that report? Would that have been a substantial change?
So I will try to answer the question. So I think what we presented in the adaptation plan, right, is that we try and keep infrastructure in one way or another, right? Keep the number of lanes to help sustain traffic through the future, right? So there will be an increase in travel in the future, but if we do not increase the capacity on those lanes, right, then I don't think we'll see induced, well, we could see induced or added VMT. But you will remember that in the adaptation plan, we said we should aim for a 20% transit component, right? And of course, though, that 20% reduction or 20% transit component will reduce the VMT substantially. So yes, the future, and that's typically what we see with general plans as well, is if we increase future traffic, and especially if we have more trips coming to the city, yes, VMT would increase. Right, and then you try to offset that by doing transit, and if you can also offset it with land use that has better jobs housing balance or shorter trips, then the VMT would be also reduced. But on the face value of the adaptation plan, I would say yes, there would be an increase in VMT.
I see. And the report that you did for that report, did that include VMTs, or was that done with the old metric?
We used level of service because we were looking at capacity, how to move cars.
Right.
I think we do have a statement in there where we provide the, the 4-lane viaduct, so the Del Monte viaduct, right? That could be, since we're going to have slightly more capacity if we do all the projects plus a 4-lane viaduct, the bridge, right, for Del Monte that goes from Sloat to the tunnel. That could construe an increase in VMT by itself, just because you're building the facility, more cars would get into the city, drive into the city.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, I have one.
Yeah, I sure
Go
do.
ahead. There's 2 people. Mike, go ahead.
Thank you. You say that you have some good numbers that have been calculated in by the county. I don't know about that. Has any of this been tested in court? Has any of this been tested in the real world? It's when reading through this stuff, and I'm an engineer. It was a sleep-inducing project, to say the least. But going through this stuff, I just couldn't imagine coming up with the original numbers that you're going to have to beat. It's just sort of beyond my ken.
Right. Maybe I can answer first, Michael, and then just to be clear, the cities that are losing lawsuits for CEQA are losing them on the basis that if they don't use VMT. VMT is the required threshold adopted by the state of California. So we have to use VMT.
I get that. I get that it's required, but I don't get that it's accurate.
So I can let Michael and Frederick talk about accuracy.
Sure, and that's a great question. You know, and your observation is a good one too. This is very complicated stuff. But the way we calculated it, and way a lot of jurisdictions currently are, is we use the travel demand model. So the AMBAG, who's the one who develops the model, has essentially created a model that's supposed to mimic human behavior and basically assign trips. And so we use that tool to estimate what we think VMT will be. And the foundation of that tool is they've gone out and asked people questions about, well, where do you travel? How far do you go? Where do you work? Where do you live? And all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of real world data that's been brought into this tool that we help use to forecast. So the tool considers things like if I'm putting a new development here, well, it considers the proximity of employment opportunities, of school, of retail, all these other things. So this forecast tool is the principal thing that we use. So unfortunately, the only way to get better information is either to use real world data or to use some type of GPS stuff. So this estimation tool is, the model, which is, like I said, based on real world data, is really the principal tool that everyone's using throughout the state for this right now.
And if I can maybe answer on the legal question. So this is brand new, right? I think we're only aware of 2 or 3 court cases right now, but not on a project basis. It's actually about policies. So there's the agency being sued on their adoption of the policy. There's also where they did not follow the OPR guidance. But we do quite a bit of work with attorneys. And, I have been in commission meetings where the attorneys would answer, this is brand new. We haven't had case law. We cannot respond to it, right? So because it's so new. And yes, obviously, like with level of service, there's always court cases. I think it would be foolish to anticipate that there would not be court cases on VMT on a project basis as well.
Dan, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do.
Steve, go ahead. Go ahead.
Does VMT environmentally distinguish between electric miles versus gasoline miles?
That's a great question. Interestingly, no, it doesn't. So you don't get credit right the way. There's a separate chapter in the document, in the CEQA document about greenhouse gases, where that type of stuff is directly dealt with. But VMT, it doesn't matter if it's an electric car or a gas car the way that it's currently written. So, and part of the answer to that as well, SB 743 isn't just about greenhouse gases. It's also about trying to promote sustainability and some of the other things as well, kind of thing. Although greenhouse gases is definitely the top line of the effort.
At one time, was VMT tied into possible substitution for the gas tax as part of this bill, or were they split up, or were they entirely separate?
Another great point. Actually, that's a conversation that I still hear other jurisdictions still having about, in the future, are we going to need to move to that as more electric vehicles happen? Obviously that's hurting gas tax, which is, a big revenue for transportation. So some folks have proposed that ultimately a VMT tax of some form may be the replacement for that. But to date, nobody's formalized that into a policy.
Thank you.
Good question, though.
Next, any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Let's go back to a project of a couple of years ago where there was a certain style of analysis used to evaluate whether the Highway 68 roundabout would actually impact in a positive way the congested traffic going in and out of the Presidio, on Lighthouse Avenue, in the tunnel. And, the result would have been that if it had benefited traffic congestion, perhaps we could have done something about the reduction in number of lanes on Lighthouse Avenue. I know that the representatives from Kimley and Horn may not be familiar with this, but it was always used as a study to see whether or not we could do something about the congestion on Lighthouse Avenue. And I'm guessing that study was based on level of service. So jump forward to today and VMT, how would that metric have affected the analysis of the effectiveness of the Highway 68 roundabout?
That's a great question. So the short answer is from an environmental standpoint. So if I'm only considering it from a CEQA standpoint, Well, actually, roundabouts are a form of traffic control that specifically you can make a finding of non-significance on the face of it. You don't have to carry it any further. If you're changing a signalized intersection to a roundabout, there's no significant impact. That's allowable. Now, if the question is, well, how do I consider it from a congestion standpoint? Well, that would occur outside of the CEQA discussion. It would need to occur more from the purview of the city saying, well, we want to evaluate congestion. And there's nothing to preclude you from going ahead and doing level of service analysis for that. And in fact, that would probably still be the normal course of trying to understand an improvement or understand whether it's a good use of money or not, that you'd want to evaluate it from a level of service standpoint if you were to look at something like that.
Yeah, so the engineering design would resolve the congestion problem as far as possible. CEQA would rely on VMT, and I can share it, but Caltrans also recently said that they will apply all roundabouts to be non-significant for VMT impact. So any roundabout you build, no significant impact whatsoever on VMT.
Dan, do you have any questions?
No, very good dialogue. It's quite interesting.
Terry?
Mute.
I don't have anything else.
Thank you. A couple of questions. When you look at this, the difference between VMT and LOS, well, we are a tourist industry as our primary money earner. We also have the military, which I think the military's done as much as they can to try to reduce the in and out traffic during the day. Maybe we're going to have to continue that dialogue, but our tourists are seasonal, and when they come, sometimes you can get caught by surprise. Is there a mitigation tool in this TDM to address how we're going to fix those things?
Yes and no. So, from a purely congestion standpoint, that wouldn't be a CEQA consideration, but the TDM measures, they can have an impact on congestion because, like I said, there's kind of two ways you can reduce VMT. One is to shorten the trip, so I put something closer to you that you want to go to, or else I eliminate the trip. So things like if an example of a TDM could be a shuttle service that gets folks out of their cars and into a shuttle, or if I build an improved bicycle facility that I get folks out of their cars and they take the bicycle facility, or better pedestrian stuff. So those are all examples of TDM measures that can be implemented that'll have the net effect of reducing VMT just because we're getting folks out of their cars.
Okay, and does that also address any ways to reduce the traffic? For instance, when we go down to the aquarium, that's a traffic mitigation problem already. And I imagine that if things open up, we're going to get even more buried in that kind of traffic. And how do we do it with an existing city that has a structure and has a fixed roadways? How does this LOS and VMT address existing problems and the conversion?
So, different jurisdictions have taken different tacks to address what you're kind of getting at, because a lot of jurisdictions that we work with have continued to say, okay, well, we're going to change our CEQA policy to follow SB 743, which is required, but we're going to go ahead and maintain level of service as a parallel effort for the purposes of what you're kind of getting at, is we still feel like we need improvements to deal with congestion. Safety is still an important consideration. Access, safe egress and ingress out of a site. So a lot of jurisdictions still have maintained a level of service policy. They kind of relied on CEQA to kind of do that for them in the past. So they've kind of said now, okay, well, since CEQA is not doing that for us any longer, we need to create our own policy that kind of fits our local needs to continue to use that method.
So if a project comes in, so it's unfortunately it's very difficult to get existing businesses to just make a simple change to TDM, right? And I think the city is in a process of working, and we've had some effort before COVID to talk to the business community about what can we do to help relieve some traffic through getting your employees to take TDM measures, right? But if a new project comes in, obviously the more and more you build, the more and more traffic you're going to add, right? So you're going to increase the congestion, right? So, but the VMT is probably not going to tell that story, right? The VMT may show, if we take the hotel that Mike spoke about, if we build another hotel, right? So the people drive in for the weekend, and once they're there, then we want them to not take their car and drive everywhere. We don't want the car to go to the aquarium. We want to go to Pebble Beach or go to Laguna Seca for an event, right? We would like them to take transit then, or take a bike or walk. So then on the project, you would then want to put a condition to say, yes, we still want you to do TDM to help reduce your trips in the network. And through that TDM measure that you do, you can then manage the congestion as well. I think.
Well, under our current structure, I don't see that happening, adding more hotels. But thank you for that. I do have one other question. Under the VDM mitigation, it mentioned unbundling of parking. How does that work in here?
So unbundling of parking is a very tricky, it's site specific and area specific, right? So unbundling of parking, of course, means that you can say, well, we're going to, let's say for a residential project, you can rent an apartment and not lease a parking space that comes with the apartment. So it means that you tell them you're either not going to have a car or you're going to find a parking space elsewhere, right? But you got to be extremely careful because, we know rents are high and people will come in and say, well, I don't want to pay that extra $100 or $50 or whatever it is for a parking space. So they will not sign it up for the agreement, but then you run the risk that they go park somewhere in the neighborhood, right? And then they impact street parking elsewhere. So you got to put the project in context of where parking supply and demand is and what the area looks like.
Yeah, just to kind of add to that a little bit in short, what they're trying to do is if the real cost of parking becomes a separate item, that might discourage some folks from having a car just because they don't want to pay for it. So it's kind of a financial incentive to get folks out of their car.
Now I know the city also has, so you do in lieu fees, or somebody can pay for parking in your parking structures right in the garage. And I'll let Kim talk a little bit about that. So you can surely do that and not provide the parking on the site, right? But provide parking in a parking structure where there is parking spaces available. But that's not reducing. That's not really, in that case, it may not be a VMT reduction, right? Because there's still a car and the car is still doing a trip. So that's why you got to be very careful about unbundling parking for VMT purposes.
Any other questions? I guess I have a question for Andrea if she's
I have
still.
one more. I just have one
Go
more.
ahead, Sandy.
So if level of service is a metric that was used for analyzing traffic impacts since 1950, which is 70 years by my calculation, does that mean that the projects that were either approved or disapproved on that basis are grandfathered in, and now we are beginning a new paradigm beginning February the 23rd, 2021 for new projects? Or are we going back in time and evaluating projects already approved or disapproved based on LOS?
So in short, the answer is no. We're not. There's no need to go back in time, kind of thing. And again, this is strictly CEQA specific. So it's just any project that comes forward that requires an environmental review will have to comply with this. But that again, that doesn't preclude you from it doesn't preclude you from allowing you to use level of service for other purposes. You just can't use it for CEQA any longer.
Okay.
But like I said, most jurisdictions are still finding a place for level of service depending on their needs, kind of thing.
Thank you. I have a question for Andrea if she's still connected. Well, my question, maybe someone else can. Okay, thank you. Is this going to have to add to your workload another layer of review for submission to the city and staff?
It's going to have an impact on a workload of planning and traffic engineering, but whether we're looking at VMT or LOS, we still have to look at a metric under CEQA. And so, again, I know Frederick and Mike did a great job in a presentation, and one of the considerations as on whether we are still going to look at level of service also. So there are some choices to be made in the future also.
Thank you, Andrea. And a question for Kim. Is this going to add to a review process where on our projects as they come forward?
Yes, in fact, it's already added. As projects have now been submitted to the city, we are if that project is not exempt from CEQA or under these thresholds, then we have to have a VMT analysis prepared. So we're currently in the process, and developers are in the process of adjusting to the new requirements. But I think it'll be extremely helpful once we have this adopted, so we can hand the developer and their traffic engineer a guidebook on how to complete the analysis.
Thank you. Any other questions before we open it up to the public? Okay, Sarah, if we could, let's open it up to the public for public comment.
Sure thing, Chair. So I just wanted to give a friendly reminder, if you are interested in making a public comment, you can go ahead and either join Zoom Gov and joining the meeting live, or you can join by telephone by dialing 833-568-8864 or 669-254-5252. And our webinar ID is 161-990-8039. And if you're prompted to enter a participant ID, simply press pound. And to make a public comment, you can just raise your hand in Zoom using the Zoom function, or if you're connected by phone, please dial *9 to raise your hand, then *6 to unmute yourself. And taking a look, it doesn't look like we have anyone interested in making a public comment at this time, but if we get any public comments, I'll be sure to let you know.
Thank you. Hearing none from the public, let's bring it back to the commission for comments. Everybody at once?
Yeah, I'll start off. Excellent presentation. I think it's pretty simple and straightforward what we need to do here. Go ahead and make this recommendation for this matrix change and get on with it. It was a very impressive presentation. Thank everybody who have contributed to that.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Yeah, I agree with Dan. It seems like we don't really have much of a choice. This is a state law, and we have to use this metric, and the city's done a really thorough presentation of why. So here we go.
Thank you, Terry.
I've got a comment.
Go ahead, Mike.
I agree that this is a requirement from the state, and our infinite wisdom in the state is making us do this. But the good news is we have a traffic engineer and some consultants who can walk us through this and make sure that we're not making some egregious errors and costing the city a ton of money. I like the fact that we're reaching out and getting help from Kimley Horn. I know I've worked with Kimley Horn at the airport. I mean, they've done a lot of work for the airport district. So I kind of trust these guys.
Thanks, Mike. Sandy?
I agree with what everybody has said. We're going to make a proposal to adopt this new metric while at the same time acknowledging that it's required by law. So we're going to do it.
And I'll just make one comment that Mike said exactly what I was going to say, but I was going to say in their infinite wisdom or not, just the one qualifier. But and I do appreciate this. It was a great presentation, very thorough, and you've answered our questions, I thought, very well. Any other comments before we take a vote? Okay, then I ask for a vote.
I'll move that we recommend to the City Council adoption of a resolution designating vehicle miles traveled as the metrics for conducting transportation impact analysis to comply with Senate Bill 743.
Thank you. A second?
I'll second it.
And we have Commissioner Fletcher and Commissioner Dawson as the first and second. And we have a roll call vote.
Definitely. Your first, Chair Brassfield,
Aye.
and Vice Chair Freeman,
Yes,
Commissioner Dawson,
Yes.
Commissioner Fletcher,
Yes.
Commissioner Latassa,
Aye.
Commissioner Milich,
Yes.
Commissioner Reed is absent. So that vote passed with 6 votes. Sorry,
Thank
that
you.
motion passed.
We have any other items that people want? Kim, do we have any commission? Well, we have comments coming, but informal staff reports?
Just a couple announcements. I have a planning office update attached to your report. You might be interested tomorrow evening, or Wednesday evening, the city council will be holding a special session on cannabis. And I think what we're looking for from the council is what our next step is. We have a lot of public outreach that's been done by our city manager's office. And we're either going to probably get direction to move forward with an ordinance or take a step back and maybe do something else in terms of public outreach. So if they decide to go forward, you could start to expect to see that in front of the Planning Commission in the upcoming months. If they decide to take a step back, then we'll obviously report that as well. So cannabis tomorrow night, you might want to listen in. In addition, we have 3 agenda items for the next meeting. We have an appeal, very similar to the appeals on Del Monte Avenue regarding a historic listing. We have a use permit for 167 Davis. And we've also been working, that same team that did such a tremendous job tonight, Fernanda, Andrea, and Marissa, have been working on an update to our circulation element to reflect a lot of the issues we discussed this evening. So we'll be bringing a rough draft of that circulation element to you at the next meeting before we initiate environmental review and finalize the documents. So it should be a good meeting on March 9th, and look forward to seeing everyone then.
Thank you. Any final commissioner comments?
I do have one. While we were sitting here, my phone went off very loudly, and I wish someone would have reminded me to turn it off before I sat down here, because that's kind of embarrassing.
Isn't that your cat stop?
No, not my cat. No, no.
Oh, okay.
Any other commissioner
Yeah,
comments?
I have one question. Perhaps, Kim, you could answer this for me. I'm real curious about our trash mitigation programs around the city and along the freeways. Have they been put on hold because of COVID?
So are you talking about Highway 1 and the trash that
I
we're
mean, there's
starting?
trash everywhere,
Yeah.
everywhere. It's so disheartening because it's like we're third world country here, and this is the most beautiful part of the world.
So if this is regarding our freeways, I believe the city manager and the mayor were going to have a meeting with the Central Coast representative of Caltrans. The state had put a temporary, I guess, stay, if you will, on cleaning up freeways in COVID times, and specifically various encampments. So I haven't heard the results of that meeting, but I can certainly ask and find out what progress was made.
Would you please?
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Any other comments?
I would like to make my annual comment about receiving a report on what effect on the circulation part of the general plan the roundabout up in Pebble Beach had. We still haven't addressed what's happening to traffic on Lighthouse.
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. Hearing no others, I would like to bid everywhere a goodbye and close the meeting.
thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Adios.